The game of keepy uppy we play at Time for All Ages reminds me of a story from a few years ago. So a handful of years ago, I was walking around my backyard, and it was fall down in Southern California, just outside of San Diego. So in very fall fashion, it was still quite warm. The sun shone in such a way to make the flowers and the succulents in my yard pop with color. This was the place that I was still just getting to know, having only moved in there for about a year and a half before that. But a place in which I found great solace. This particular fall day, my spirit was weary. It had been a busy summer leading into a busy fall, and a lot was changing around me. This was the afternoon of Erev Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and in our household, it had become a tradition for me to pick up a pomegranate for my Jewish wife in celebration of the sweet New Year. But I hadn't. That afternoon, I finally had the mental space and the short window of time to stop at a store and pick one up, and there were none to be picked up. I was sad, disappointed in myself, which I soon came to realize how much the pomegranate had become a symbol of all those things I'd failed to do or get right in the midst of all the changes and busyness. I was pretty far down that way of thinking when something caught my eye. There was something sitting on the back retaining wall of our fence. It was brightly colored and it stuck out against the browns and the greens around it. It seemed as though one of our neighbor kids must have kicked their ball across the fence. So I went to retrieve it in order to give it back to them. Only when I got closer, I realized that this bright red sphere wasn't a ball at all. It was a pomegranate. Ripe and whole and still attached to the tree I hadn't even realized we had in the midst of the bright green leaves in our backyard. Over the last months, a small flower had bloomed and grown into this magnificent pomegranate, just in time for Rosh Hashanah. My surprise quickly turned into relief and awe at this little bit of grace that had bloomed in the midst of a changing world and waited patiently for me to slow down and notice it. As our world changes so quickly around us, grief and stress and weariness are so present for so many of us. When we stop for a moment, we may realize on various levels that we may or may not be okay, either individually, collectively, societally, and that things are changing. In his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk demonstrates how chronic stress and trauma can actually change the way our brain and body works. Van der Kolk says in his 2016 interview that people who suffer from trauma want to forget it because it's too much, and society wants to forget it because it's too much also. As we go through stressful things, it is easy to try and want to forget things. If this is true for an individual, how much more is this true when an entire society is in upheaval? But we don't forget. Our bodies don't forget. So what do we do with that? Well, one of the first things we can do is to pay attention. So, would you do an experiment with me? As much as it's accessible to you right now, without judgment, without thinking much about it, name one emotion and one physical feeling you have right now. You can just think about it. You don't have to say it out loud. Now, pay attention, again, if this is accessible to you, to your body. Perhaps a couple of deep breaths help you find those places where this is stored, this emotion, happy or sad or whatever it is. And as you start scanning your body to find where that emotion is, what did you notice? Were there places of stress and tension, pain, of joy and release? Our bodies are wise, and they hold a lot for us. And now, as you are comfortable, I invite you to find just some physical motion to release whatever it is that you're holding, either letting joy into the world or releasing that stress. Maybe you roll your shoulders or wiggle your fingers or get up and dance or do something in your seat that feels more comfortable to you. What our world and our society and our communities are going through as individuals, as congregations, as our association, has already begun to find home in our bodies, in our physical, individual bodies, and in our collectives. The concept of fractal, made popular by Adrienne Marie Brown, reminds us that what happens on the micro level is repeated up through the macro level. And you math folks, I'm happy to talk about the mathematic concept of fractal in fellowship hour. And it creates patterns in our systems. And we need to take time to heal the trauma, recover from the stress, and dream together of how we want to be as a community going forward. So what if we slowed down even for a moment? Perhaps, as Morgan Harper Nichols said in the reading, perhaps in slowing down, I will learn to peel back the layers and find that even here, in the wild of my worry, my heart is still beating. Peace will still find me here. Joy will still find me here. Peace and joy will find us here. Peace and joy and possibility, it is a possibility even in the midst of the uncertainty that surrounds us. There are invitations within that uncertainty to reimagine our world and imagine what you as a church, who you are, and how you will move forward together. Cultural theorists like Anne Swidler tell us that the formation and reformation of culture is part of our meaning-making process. That the formation and reformation of that often takes place most intentionally when things are uncertain, when we're having to try to make and remake meaning of our world. And to do this, I firmly believe that we have the tools we need to do that within Unitarian Universalism. And those tools, are two of them that I want to talk about this morning. One, of course, is covenant, which may not surprise you given that I'm here to talk about covenant with you all. And the second is grace. So first, grace. I love knowing that this was a Swedish Lutheran, not a Norwegian, but a Swedish Lutheran church when it was founded. I grew up in the Midwest where Lutheranism was large, and I actually grew up Lutheran and became a Lutheran minister. And while much of that tradition doesn't suit me and I don't suit it anymore, there is one central part of the theology of Lutheranism that I still hold dear, and that is the notion of grace. Using the language of that tradition, at the heart of the Lutheran concept of grace is the notion that we are never beyond God's love. There is nothing we can do to earn it, and therefore there is nothing we can do to lose it. Simply as creatures created in imago Dei, the image of God or the divine, we can show up every day knowing we are loved, we are love, and we are free to respond to the others knowing the same is true for us, even as we mess up over and over again, even as the balloon drops over and over again. We are held and loved right back into relationships with ourselves and with others. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, they're part of the underlying Lutheran theology of grace, especially regarding sin and salvation, which don't necessarily translate for some of us. And even the language of God or divine isn't helpful for some. Yet the more I dwell in the sea of Unitarian Universalism, which I have been doing for many, many years now, I see the need for a theology of grace. And even more hopefully, The more I dwell in this sea, the more I find within our Unitarian Universalism a notion of grace that's alive and well. Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt writes, our first principle, this was before our Article 2, but is still resonant within the values. We are called to learn a language of resilience and liberation in response to the pain of this world we have inherited, so that we might find wholeness and grace in our brokenness. That we might find wholeness and grace in our brokenness. Within our stories, there is brokenness, there is pain, there is grief, and in that brokenness, we are invited to find wholeness and, yes, even grace. Within our joys and our sorrows, there is invitation to grace. Finding and creating places where wholeness and grace in our brokenness can flourish, or as our poet today says, where grace can bloom. Finding those pomegranates can be difficult work, individually and collectively. But fortunately, we have another tool for being in community in search of wholeness, and that, of course, will come as no surprise at this point, is covenant. As we start to imagine individually and collectively what these next months and years will bring, we still find ourselves in uncertain times. One which exists in between an ending and beginning, in which we have opportunity to reclaim and reimagine the hope and promise of a covenantal community. One rooted in Unitarian Universalism, one rooted in this important place in Idaho. Covenant, as the Commission on Institutional Change reminds us in unlocking the power of covenant, requires that we be present for one another, and that we engage in community, and that we work for the good of the entire community. I have seen so much of this lived out, even in the short time I have been with you. Covenant binds us together, holds us in love, and invites us to show up every day knowing we are loved, and we are free to respond to one another knowing the same is true for them. Love truly is at the center. Even as we mess up over and over again, because we are human and we are fallible, we are held and loved back into right relationships with ourselves and with others. Does that sound familiar? The connection between covenant and grace is not new. Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker spoke of the connection in her 1998 sermon at the General Assembly, where she said, "The dimensions of covenant is important for us to recover. It is an antidote to our radical individualism. We need this in older sense. Covenant is brought into being by grace and sustained by practice." One of the greatest gifts of being a part of this church, in this region, and indeed the entirety of the Unitarian Universalist Association, of which you are an important part, is that our covenant calls us into a truth that our story is not one of isolation and individualism, that our I is always and indivisibly connected to our we. Our I is connected to our we. Renowned queer theologian Father Patrick S. Chang explains radical love as a love so extreme that it dissolves our existing boundaries. And in this time, communities of faith and our entire movement is poised for the sacred task of imagining what a future rooted in radical love, with love at the center, could actually look like. We can ask ourselves, who are we? And what do we need to become? How do we need to be together? Knowing that becoming is an ongoing act, a practice. As we move forward, we're making choices individually and collectively about who we are, how we are together, and what we want to be. What are the tough questions we might ask ourselves as we discern the we and the to what we are called in this time and place. We can ask ourselves what barriers have been brought down and what barriers are being put up, which we can challenge. What connections are being forged and what are in need of repair. What healing is needing to begin and has been happening. And where has grace been blooming? I will look back on this season, our poet says, with gratitude that I chose to breathe deep and travel through. I had to be stronger than I ever thought I would have to be. But even when I couldn't see it, grace was blooming fully within me. Listening deeply to one another, we can start to see where grace is blooming for us and within us. Developing a covenant to hold us through good and difficult is an act of collective grace. And remember, we are not alone. This covenantal community is a source of great hope and promise. And we need each other to broaden our imagining and understanding of radical love and journey together in support through challenges, to challenge one another and live out the practice of grace. The interconnected web of all binds us in responsibility, holds us in love, and blooms through us as grace. Our covenant with each other means that you, beloveds, are a part of a vast movement, and together we will move boldly toward wholeness. Amen. Blessed be. May it be so.